So, reasons you might choose each approach. Start with classical. If there's any doubt, I think Helen and I both agreed. We spent a couple of hours over coffee, would you believe, going through this.
I think we do for you.
And I think we both agree that if there's any doubt, if you're not sure what you're doing, a classical periodisation approach is a fairly safe bet. You'll get a decent level of performance without much risk attached to it. We've got all the evidence. It's been used many times successfully. Like I say, it's reliable. It's fairly low risk in terms of getting that performance you want. Builds a good depth of endurance. That early base training period builds a really good depth of endurance, which will stand you in good stead for the rest of the season and subsequent seasons as well. It's that training history, it builds that side of things. And it's a sound investment in terms of a really good winter of base training. Like we say, it will give you a good season, and it's miles in the bank for subsequent seasons. And it's that depth of endurance which, if you keep adding to, it's the reason perhaps quite often experienced high-level cyclists can get by with very little training and get seemingly really high performances of tiny amounts of training in a short period of time, is because they've got that depth of endurance. So it's a classical periodisation approach is a sound investment in future performance, and holding form for longest as well. If you're targeting a specific race on a specific day, it's perhaps not important. But if you're targeting a 4-week period where you want to be at your best, or a long period, then having that big endurance base behind you is going to allow you to hold your peak form for a longer period. But even on the single day events, having all that endurance training, it's going to perhaps reduce the variability in your performance. You're all aware some days you get on the bike and you're absolutely flying, and the following day you might really be struggling. And a really big base, a strong base behind you, is going to minimise that fluctuation in performance. So that even for a one day peak is quite important. Reasons for choosing reverse periodisation. As Mike said, if your goal event is really long, you might want to get your high intensity training out of the way before you move to the specific training close to your goal event. I've put time crunched to steal Chris Carmichael's term. If for some reason you can't train indoors, if turbo training is not your thing, or if you share a flat with someone who won't let you ride the turbo, or for any reason like that, if you can only train in daylight hours, you might not be able to complete the volume during the winter when it's dark. So you do a few hours, you keep the intensity up when it's dark. As the evenings get lighter, you can get out on your bike and you can do and I think that's quite a common reason people choose this approach. Although, as I say, there is a greater risk with it. There's less evidence in how successful it is. As we spoke about earlier, by doing the high intensity training without that foundation in place, you might not be building the structures you need. So you might not reach such a high level by doing that approach. Greater risk of injury going straight into high intensity training before you've built up not just the structures, but in terms of strengthening the tendons and things like that. So there is a greater risk to it. And in the block periodisation, one reason you might is if you've got a longevity in endurance sports. You've tried this approach year on year, you get to a good level, but you're starting to get to the stage where you need to try something different, maybe to improve that extra 1 or 2%, which might make a big difference to you. If you've got a longevity in endurance sports, you've perhaps got that fantastic depth of endurance, which is going to enable you to try an approach like this, where you can cycle through things a bit more quickly. Changing the diesel to a turbo. So again, this fantastic endurance depth, you can ride all day at a reasonably high intensity, but you want to develop that ability to go and rev a bit more quickly. Because you're cycling through your training aims much quicker, you can perhaps spend more time working on top end training and really get that extra intensity in there. Motivation, staleness, because you're swapping things around a lot quicker. You've never you've never got a change in your training too far in the future. So again, this idea of having an intermediate goal, you've perhaps got 4 to 6 weeks, and then you're trying something different. So you're never thinking, my God, I've got another 12 weeks of this to go. I'm not going to get through this. Always something to change it up. The reason perhaps it was used in the first place for competition, if you need to compete fairly frequently for any reason, the realisation block at the end where you freshen up, you can probably compete at a quite a high level there. And as we said, you do need a considerable amount of self-awareness and a very, very sort of close relationship with your coach to know when you need to swap to a different type of training, so how long that block's going to be, like Craig said. Because if you feel perhaps that you are losing a bit of top-end fitness because of that idea of cumulative training effect, that you want to revisit every area before you've started to detrain in it, but if you really feel that you are losing some aspect, you need to really pick up on it quickly so that you can do a short block and work on that. So you need to be close dialogue with your coach and be really self-aware in terms of how you feel and how you think your training's going. And again, greater risk just because it's not something that's been tried a lot. It is a fairly new idea, and that idea of having multiple peaks, does it ultimately mean that you're not going to reach such a high level? So, on that side of things. Just as a bit of an exercise, just to see how individual it is. There's I've got 3 examples here of different types of cyclists, and you can perhaps think to yourself, maybe offer up a suggestion of what type of periodisation you might use. So for a road racer, needs to compete at a high level all year round, whether that's again because he needs to make some money out of it, sponsor pressure. A common one for UK-based road racers is picking up those licence points so you can progress up the British cycling leagues. So any suggestions on which approach you might favour with someone like that? No? Block one? Yeah? Anything different? Classical? Yeah, I think you could make a really strong case for either of those. The classical periodisation, you're going to build that really big depth of endurance in the off season, which is hopefully going to carry them through the season. The block periodisation, perhaps if they have been training and racing for longer, they've already got that depth of endurance, because you've got these frequent rest breaks where they're going to be at a high level, that might be enough to get things. So again, already with a fairly common scenario, we've already seen that there's two different approaches you could take, and then within those approaches, again, you can change the details on how you work them, so it really is an individual thing. Time trialist, that's not me, despite what you might think. A double peak, it's a classic UK-based one again. The Nationals earlier in the year, and then the British Time Trial Champs in September. Got a little bit of experience, but it's the first time they've sort of stepped up to national level. Again, maybe which way you could go with that? I mean, I've deliberately kept the information fairly sparse so that there is a bit of choice there.
Reverse.
Go with the reverse one? Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, you don't know with them how much time they've got through the winter. They've got a bit of time between the events to rebuild things, so that could potentially work with a block of intense training in the winter before working on the endurance when the nights get longer, before doing the race specific work again before the events. I think you could use any approach with that person. As you say, it really is individual. There's not enough information there to choose, but that's one side of things. And then a sportive rider, perhaps they're training for the attack in July. Another common scenario. I've done a few UK-based sportives, so they're not a novice rider by any stretch of the imagination. Any input on that one? Reverse, yeah, that's a really good example of where you might use a reverse, because their event is an ultra endurance event. You can get the intense work at the start. Similarly, you can go classical just as likely. I'd say probably the block periodisation is the one where you might not use here, because with just a few years they might not have the depth of endurance, although again it depends on how they've trained for those sports, so you don't know enough there. There's another one. Yeah, again, a bit more background on the person himself. There's a restriction there in terms of time, so it's perhaps a bit more support for the reverse periodisation, so that when it is dark and they can spend time indoors on the turbo, maybe with some intensity in the evenings before building it up. Yeah, it's for exactly that reason. So if you know that endurance is going to be the main factor that's going to be important for your goal, your dream goal, and again, it's where your profile as a rider comes into it as well. If your dream goal needs endurance, and you know that endurance is one of the weaker aspects of your profile, then you might devote more time to that, even if in the meantime you might be racing shorter events. You might still train with that endurance in mind. So in some ways you're perhaps training suboptimally for what you're doing at the moment, but with the idea of it really feeding into that longer term goal, which is where it can be really nice to have that longer term that approach to your training. So the periodisation came more from sprint-based power-based activities. So it's maybe the idea of building force or speed first, depending on the way you do it. So in the classical way, you might build that force, so pure strength in terms of maybe gym work, standing starts, things like that. Work on high cadence drills to build the speed before you combine the two to get the power. So is that approach?
But does that still require the base level fitness to be able to?
And again, yeah, it's building the base training is going to build the capacity that you can recover from your hard efforts for the sprint training, and that you can complete more of it. So if you've got 12 to 16 weeks of really good endurance training behind you, you might be able to go out and do maybe 12 standing starts in a training session at a high level before you lose the quality, as opposed to maybe doing 6 and then being so tired, and then you might be able to recover from it in a day and do another session. Whereas without that base endurance, it might take you a week to recover from it. In which case, there's two approaches I think you could take to that. One would be to use the block periodisation and cycle it more, or you might just include a little bit of intensity within a classical periodisation, so just follow the general structure, but then accept that you have maybe one session a week where you do have slightly higher intensity. I think, and again, I think you need very, very little training stimulus of a type to maintain fitness. So I don't think there's any need to do a lot of training. For instance, maybe half an hour at a slightly higher intensity might be enough to keep it. Or that is a difficult question.
Especially, I mean, you're right. In some ways, if you go back to the strength training, so weight training literature, they say that weight training, doing 4 to 6 reps, 4 sets, helps you keep some of your fast twitch fibre pool for longer into older age. So if you apply that to cycling, you might say, well, some sprint work will help you keep those fast twitch fibres. But the balance point is, and this is why Dan started off with the quite cagey, it depends, is because you also take longer to recover as you get older. So you do hear stories where people have tried to do high intensity training and destroyed themselves. I was reading a paper the other day that looked at a review of how the elite cyclists train, and there's this like polarisation of the training load. They spend 80% doing very low intensity training. It's only 20% of their week they spend on high intensity stuff, because you just you can't keep doing high intensity stuff, and that the capacity to cope with it diminishes with age as well. So yes, maybe high intensity training helps the older athlete, but you might not be able to do as much of it as someone who's younger. So